I'm going to talk about an individual as an agent of foreign policy. And the previous speaker made a very good introduction also to my presentation by saying that actually every individual has an opportunity to make a space for herself or himself in a society. While this can be a little bit easier, maybe in economic sphere, than foreign policy sphere is a very complicated and very elitist sphere of activity where individuals have a very limited access or very limited impact. As I have already learned that several of you have studied international relations or political science, so if you remember from your lectures at the university about the international relations theory, then you know that there are three schools of thought. Realism, which says that nation-states are the main actors of international relations. And then there are the liberal school of theory, who says that also institutions and non-state actors can be actors of international relations. And then you have constructivism saying that actually ideas and the political culture and culture of a society can determine how foreign policy is conducted in a country. Well, as you know, in Western hemisphere, let's say the Western world, the liberal democratic order is prevailing and dominating. And it all started after the Second World War with institution building and this Bretton Woods system, followed then by NATO and by European Community of Coal and Steel. And all these institutions became very important actors in order to rebuild the Europe after the Second World War. But besides these institutions and nation states who were then working in parallel, you always also had individuals, either politicians or heads of states, who, despite this sort of a common or traditional trend, changed history or changed the course of history, or made an impact on foreign policy or international relations between the countries. And again, when you think from a theoretical perspective, then there has always been a debate going on whether the structures, states, institutions are more important than individual agents. And the views are differing because the international relations theorists think that when you want to get a bigger pattern of social interactions, then of course institutions matter more. Nation states matter more than an individual. But when you look at what, for example, think tankers or foreign policy analysts say about this, then it's the other way around. They say that when the world history or history of international relations is dependent on events, then individuals become much more important in this regard, because they can become game changers. I mean, just if you look to David Cameron, what he has done to his country at the moment when he actually declared a referendum of EU membership, and now the country is actually heading towards the Brexit. This is sort of a change in course of history. He became a game changer. When you think of Donald Trump, is he a game changer? Yes, indeed he is, because he has put the whole sort of value-based liberal democratic order under question. Okay, yes, he's still part of a Western system, but he has made his foreign policy very transactionalist, very much dependent on dealing rather than principles, agreements, and international law. Then again, as Lena already mentioned, I don't know whether our president, our current president, Mrs. Kersti Kaljurand, whether she's a game changer. She might be, because indeed there has never been a high-level political meeting between the presidents of these two countries, Estonia and Russia, since the independence of Estonia in 1991. Never. And this was almost a taboo to make a proposal to go and meet, because we knew that, well, Russia would never come with such kind of proposal to Estonia anyway. Russia didn't really, well, let's say, Russian leadership never really treated Estonia as an independent country. So, and our political relationships are very complicated due to many different reasons, and you may know some of them. But at the end of the day, I think that she broke this taboo. She went to Moscow to open up a newly renovated embassy building, which is a historical building for Estonia. And why she did it? I mean, Estonia is at the moment in between of two governments. We've just had elections. The old government is no longer active, and the new government is not yet at place. So she decided that she will go to Moscow. And out of courtesy, of course, she decided to let the office of Russian president know that she's in town. And of course, if possible, she would be happy to meet. But I think that Estonians are quite rational in that sense that they didn't expect an instant yes, or I don't think that our president expected that. But she got a positive answer from Kremlin, and indeed they spent more time together than expected. And what the result of this meeting will be, we don't know. Maybe there will be no result at all. But in a way, she's a game changer in the relationship between the Baltics and Russia. And in that regard, I think it's her sort of courage. And I mean, she's a very no-nonsense person. She does what she believes in, and I think in that sense it was a positive step, hopefully for a better relationship between these two countries. But I didn't want to get stuck into our president's visit to Russia. I actually, when talking about individual agency, then I don't even want to talk about sort of heads of states or diplomatic establishment. I wanted to talk about individual agent as a citizen of a country and citizens' influence on foreign policy or international relations. It has been quite limited, as I said in the beginning, but my argument is that it is growing. And it is growing in a sense that we see that a citizen actually has a role to play, especially in a democratic society. And why is that? As I said, the foreign policy has always been a very elitist sort of sphere of activity. It is conducted by diplomats, by heads of states, prime ministers sometimes, and whatever happens at home, for example, even if decisions are taken at home, then they are always explained by politicians as necessary ones, as the situation in the world is such and such, and we are living in troublesome times, and so on and so forth, especially when you sort of are very much interconnected with the international system and institutions and international law and all these aspects. Then today, I mean, very much the domestic agenda is sort of intruding the foreign policy agenda. And why am I saying that? I mean, again, Estonia is a good example here. When Estonia became independent, and first we started to build up our own country, our own nation state, and then we started preparations for joining NATO and the European Union, and all this sort of applying for membership was a very elitist project in Estonia, because we had very good diplomats, we had a very sort of good president, Lennart Meri at the time, who took Estonia to Europe, who tried to convince the Europeans that Estonia's right place is among liberal democratic countries. And all these decisions up to the 1st May of 2004, when membership actually became a reality, I think ordinary people knew very little about the Union. They knew very little about what this was all about and what our own obligations were. I mean, I think for a population it was explained like something we need to do in order to secure ourselves, in order to build up our institutions, our security, and so on and so forth. So when the first economic recession came 2008, when we were already members of the European Union and NATO, I think since then people have started to understand what this actually means. That you have gains, you benefit from membership, but you also have obligations. And maybe this became a little bit as a shock. And I mean, Estonians didn't understand why they had to bail out Greece from economic crisis. Why do we, as a much poorer country, have to pay for I mean, Greek people, Greek pensioners who earned twice as much as Estonians did at that time? And the situation sort of escalated. Then already when we go further and the migration crisis in Europe, which was combined with economic recession, then suddenly this foreign policy came to the sort of conscious of or minds of ordinary people. They suddenly understood that the world is so interconnected that if you want to get security, you need to provide security. And this was, of course, a shock. So you had different kinds of reactions. The one reaction was very much a sort of growing protectionism and growing nationalism that we see not only in Estonia but in most European countries today. That we do not want this. And they started to payback to the governments who had pushed for these very liberal reforms. But at the same time, there was another movement going on, trying to sort of explain to these people that, okay, when we shut the doors, we sort of step out of the EU, step out of NATO, any of these organizations. So as a small country, what can we do on our own? And especially, I mean, all the Baltic states, what could we do? Nothing. This would be the end of our nationhood, really. So now what I see in Estonian society is a sort of a political turbulence that we see everywhere else in Europe. And for me, this is sort of, it becomes this classical security dilemma that, especially if we interpret security as freedom from being fearful, or freedom from being afraid, or freedom from being insecure. Because in many cases today, security is much more than military security, it's the societal security. So you need some basics need to be in place. You need an employment, you need to go to work, you need health assurance, you need you need education. I mean, all these basic things that we need in life. And when these things get under question or are threatened, then you become aware of the world around you. But I mean, the advantage of democratic societies compared to authoritarian societies is that you have a choice, you can do something about it. So you can vote, for example. But what this sort of classical security dilemma is all about is that while you are increasing the security of a nation state, then at the same time you are decreasing the human security in your own society. And this is happening in many countries without they actually knowing about it. That while we send, for example, our troops to invade in Afghanistan or Syria, okay, there are no Estonians in Syria, but we used to be in Afghanistan, we are now in Mali, then you have to be aware that directly you are bringing this conflict home, and you are creating this insecure situation at home, because at some point you may be obliged to take refugees from these countries where you are in. And this situation creates insecurities among your own people. So, but again, at least in Estonia, I mean, when you have these difficult choices, and at the same time you want to keep all these sort of freedoms that a liberal democratic system offers you. For example, these 4 freedoms that EU has, that you have freedom of goods, freedom of capital, freedom of people, and services. So if you still want to keep this, you have to make a compromise there. So you have to be smart, but this has to be communicated to people correctly by politicians. So whatever step a politician makes, he's responsible for this step, and he is obliged to very properly explain this to his electorate. And this is something that has been the biggest failure, I think, in most of the Western societies, that these foreign policy decisions have been taken very harshly, under time pressure, without proper communication to the societies. And I think that, well, people express these feelings by for example, indeed voting. As we say also in Estonia, unfortunately today we have a situation when we have an extreme right-wing party in our next government coalition. So the political situation in Estonia is also sort of getting more and more interesting. Reform Party, the party who was fighting for liberal ideas and economic growth and stability, won the elections, but never had the chance to build a government, because the Centre Party, who became next, decided to continue. I mean, the Centre Party was governing before the elections as well. They wanted to keep the power, so they formed a coalition, and unfortunately they didn't find any other partners than the extreme right-wing parties and a little bit more moderate sort of nationalist party. And now we are in a situation when we have a minister, for example, for interior affairs, who is publicly anti-immigration, who is publicly anti-Russian, anti-Jewish, anti-Islam, anti-every other nation than Estonians. So this will be a huge challenge. But there's nothing bad without anything good in it. And fortunately, I think the people have really mobilized themselves, and sort of they have created these different movements, and like citizens have become active. So they have platforms on social media, fighting against xenophobia and racism and all that. And they have created a sort of a platform of communications which organizes meetings and debates, public debates. And this movement is called Estonia for Everybody. So in that sense, I mean, how this impacts foreign policy. I mean, this impacts foreign policy quite a lot, because, I mean, for example, when we had to vote for this the Global Compact of Migration, which was this first internationally negotiated agreement between international governments, and this was under the United Nations mandate. Then you may remember there was this huge debate in most of the European countries whether to join this or not. And the sort of more nationalist parties were very much against it, as they saw this as some sort of the free ticket for all the immigrants to come in and invade Estonia and the other countries and take all our jobs and everything else. And this became a sort of a political debate. This was there was this citizen activism against and for, and it was the first time when this question of migration was actually discussed basically on the streets. The foreign minister at that time decided that, well, the UN questions are never interesting to anybody. We have signed these agreements before, and they never had any bigger impact. So suddenly, this question became very, very hot. At the end of the day, Estonia decided to sign this, but this treaty or agreement is actually not legally binding, so we will see where this will take us. But as a member of European Union, actually, you see that all these issues that have to do with healthcare or social welfare or employment or whatever, they have become foreign policy questions, because actually today the world is our working place. This is the world is our market, and these issues just cannot be solved at home. So when your leaders basically go abroad to negotiate on a deal or to present some idea, then actually people have learned to ask the question, what are you actually doing there? And what does this mean for us?